But first, for years we've been warned to fear the rise of the robots. But if you ask me, it's the rise of the consultants that should keep the taxpayer awake at night. Earlier this week it was reported the Palaszczuk government handed KPMG $275,000 to provide advice to the Department of Premier and Cabinet on the development of an economic recovery roadmap post-COVID. Now, I would have thought the opening of the state border would have been a pretty good place to start, but leaving that aside, surely some of the 230,000 public servants in Queensland would be able to provide the answer. I mean, after all, isn't this the sort of thing the team at Treasury are actually paid to do? But this isn't a phenomenon linked to the Sunshine State. As the Financial Review reported back in March, the federal government spending on consulting firms has tripled in a decade, costing taxpayers $1.2 billion each and every year. Again, the Commonwealth employs some 240,000 public servants. On the whole, they do a good job. So why are politicians and government departments splashing the cash on private consulting giants like Deloitte, EY, PwC to provide the sort of advice we pay civil servants to deliver? Part of the answer to that question, no doubt, lies in the age-old art of butt covering. That is to say, if the you-know-what hits the fan or the budget blows out, better to have an external so-called expert to blame. But as far as the taxpayer is concerned, the whole thing looks like one big exercise in waste, a double dip. Essentially, we're paying for the meal twice. And to make matters worse, more often than not, recently retrenched or retired civil servants reappear, this time in consultants' uniforms, a bit like a bureaucratic phoenix, back from the dead with the same advice, but at double the price. Now, this too often is what happens when new governments decree a reduction in the ranks of the public service. It's popular politics, but rarely does it deliver the efficiency dividend promised. I say to government or governments, if you don't trust the work, the judgment or the ability of your public servants, well, get rid of them. But if you do rate their ability, then ditch your expensive obsession with private consultancy firms and redirect the billions you throw at them into this nation. All right, Lauren, let's bring you in on this. What do you make of it?
Michael, I actually could not disagree more. If I had it my way, I would replace the entire government with public servants. I'm only half joking there, but seriously, I find it hilarious that the state has spent so much time trying to convince us of why we need the public service, why they are the best and the brightest compared to the private sector, when even they, when push comes to shove, would rather have the free market. They would rather choose the private sector when they actually want a job done and they actually want it done right. One of my favorite examples of bureaucratic nonsense when you give them full rights to work on a project is pretty much anything done by the Soviet Union. You look at the Baltic Sea Canal they built, and they had millions of dollars they put into this project, killed tens of thousands of people in the gulag to make it. They show up at the end. All right, we've finished it, bodies all around them. It was both too shallow and too narrow. Now, the reason that happened, of course, is because the bureaucrats can't be fired. They've got taxes no matter what. In Soviet Russia, they've got them at gunpoint. No one's going to stop paying taxes. No one's business is going under. So if you're hiring private consulting firms and private consultants and contractors, if they do a bad job, they can be fired from that job. And quite frankly, it's usually the best and the brightest that go work in the private sector rather than the public service. I would much prefer to have more consultants and less bureaucrats. On top of this, also, it comes out cheaper. You don't have to worry about superannuation. You don't have to worry about healthcare costs, leave. All of these things are covered by the private company. So for me, more consultants, less bureaucrats.
Antoinette, I'll bring you in on this, Antoinette, because I've never known an experience where a consultant was cheaper than an employee, but what do you make of it?
Look, I think the interesting thing is, and I agree with you, that there is this cult of the consultant, and it's not by accident. Since 2013, there's been a cap put on the number of public servants, and they don't want it to reach any more than what it was in 2007 under Howard. But what's really interesting is that, yes, there is a role for consultancy, and I agree with you. Sometimes the best and the brightest, Lauren, need to be external, they need to be independent, and they need to think outside of the public servant box or square, so to speak. But a recent study found that only 20% of those consultants' jobs were doing the job of consulting. 80% were actually doing the job of former public servants, and they were once former public servants. So interestingly, the ANU, the university, has capitalised on retraining public servants on how to be consultants. And so all that means is public servants go and then get rehired. But we actually don't know yet if it's cheaper or more expensive, whether you go down the consultant route or the public servant route. My only experience with public service is working in both public service journalism and commercial journalism. What I have been able to witness is that productivity is different. Innovation can be different. And sometimes in public servants, they can sometimes be a little bit complacent with their extra superannuation, with their extra very unionised benefits, and not a lot of hard work. There's, sometimes I've worked with some people in public service like, oh no, I can't talk to you anymore. It's my time for my break. It's time for my break. And I found that really infuriating. But yeah, I do find it really interesting that if we're not hiring consultants to do a consultant's job, since only 20% are being consultants, then why are we hiring consultants to do a public servant's job? To me, that doesn't make sense.
Georgie, let's bring you in here. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it's a really interesting conundrum, because I think that in any organisation, whether it is a government department or whether it's a commercial business, there is always going to be decisions that need to be made about who is best placed to do what work. Now, I would have thought that in a government department, I can absolutely see that there would be a need to bring in consultants on specific ventures. If there needs to be a strategic review, I can see that why you would want to supplement your existing workforce with that outside expertise. But I think what is problematic is if the consultants are being engaged to effectively actually do the work that the department itself is better placed to do at a much higher rate, then, ultimately you might say that it's cheaper, but it's actually not for the taxpayers, because if we're paying the premium for consultants, we're effectively paying the superannuation for those consultants. It's just going through another intermediary before it gets there. And I think that in any setting, leaders have to be able to make decisions about who is well placed to do what work. And I think you have to be mindful of what are the conditions that lead to productivity and efficiency. And I think that I'm sure there are absolutely public servants who do look at the clock and want to clock off at certain times. But I would also say that I think there are public servants who could do in 8 hours exactly as good a job as someone else could do in 15 hours when we just sort of laud this long work culture. I don't always think that the hours put in necessarily lead to great results.
Georgie, yeah, longer is not necessarily better. And I guess I'm interested in what the solution is here. Do we remove the cap on the number of public servants, because we saw a whole bunch let go just before the pandemic? And interestingly, from the ATO, from Medicare and Centrelink, who once the pandemic hit were really essential in our response to the pandemic. And that was whether or not we removed the cap was something that was debated in the last federal election. Labor and Greens were very much for removing the cap. But Michael, I'm interested, what's the answer? Do we remove the cap, but only if there are KPIs on productivity and performance?
Well, the problem with the cap has been, we've seen, well, as I said earlier, it's very politically popular to say, right, well, we'll slash the public service by 2% or we'll put in a 3% productivity dividend or commitment, which to me makes sense. Every business in the private sector has to do the same sort of thing. You've got to justify your existence. No protected workshop. But what we've often found is that those that have been made retrenched, as I say, come back in a better cut of suit, working for Deloitte. And of course, we pay for that. And of course, we've just paid for their retrenchment on the way out. So I'm not sure that we're really getting better bang for buck. I mean, the point, as I said earlier, I think is you do a whole of public service audit and you say, all right, well, if there's people here who aren't pulling their weight, flick them. I mean, it's got to apply as it does in the private sector. But if they're doing a good job, which I'd say 80% probably are, well, then I don't understand why we then keep bringing in all these third parties into the mix at a premium price. To me,
but also,
that's crazy.
I think, Michael, I think what you said is quite interesting there about the idea that you would bring in consultants as a cover. And I know there's lots of reasons why people would do that, but I would say in a way, if the answer you're constantly reaching for is outsourcing to consultants, then I think you really do need to examine what's happening within your department or within your organisation. Because is it that it's just easier to say, that sounds like a great flash, big new project, let's bring in the consultants to do that? Because in a way, that's outsourcing the decision making.
It's harder if you hire a whole team of bureaucrats to do a job versus getting a private company. If they don't do a good job, it is so much harder to fire them. And as long as you have proper oversight, because I agree, of course there would be corruption. There would be people that are going straight from the public service and then making double the money. I mean, we definitely see this in the third world, people just hiring family members as consultants for their political party and making tons of money, funneling it into all these private companies. But I'd like to think in Australia, you can get good enough oversight to find the right consultants, the right private contractors to come in and do the job, and they are easier to fire if they don't do the job right than if you hire a ton of bureaucrats. So if it's done properly, I think the taxpayer is going to get more bang for their buck, and they're going to get someone who is more qualified as long as there is the appropriate oversight.
All right, well, how about we wrap that one up there? And